The Xiaomi Mi Mix 3's rear camera was awarded a DxO Mark score 2 points higher than the Google Pixel 3. That was something I found out before having even touched the phone, so suffice to say, I had pretty high expectations for the camera on this phone. But there were a few things I was kind of curious about. For example, this phone was advertised to be able to do 960 FPS slow motion at full HD, which I thought was a bit far-fetched for a phone camera. And of course, there's the infamous sliding mechanism hiding the two front-facing cameras. Are they any good? It was also said to have a high CRI selfie light. Is that actually high CRI? We're going to find the answer to all those in this very review of the phone camera, but let's start with the rear cameras. About the dual camera setup on this phone, your main camera is actually the one on the bottom. That's your usual wide-ish camera, and the one on the top of the phone is the secondary telephoto camera. The main camera will give you a field of view roughly equivalent to about 24mm on a full-frame camera, and the telephoto lens is actually not too telly because its equivalent focal length is only about 50mm. Now, the primary wide camera, the one that actually scored 103 on DxO Mark, is actually very impressive. It's a 12-megapixel camera with optical image stabilization. Images out of it are great. It's very nicely detailed, very sharp, and optical image stabilization is always very nice to have. The colors also have a nice balance between being vivid enough while not being completely oversaturated, so I would say the colors are reasonably natural looking. I would even say that the skin tones on the main camera are excellent. So long as you're under decent lighting, I was very impressed by how this camera handles skin tones. And for a phone camera, it actually has very good dynamic range. It handled high contrast scenes particularly well, and that's before even enabling HDR. If you are dealing with particularly tricky highlights, HDR does do a decent job at keeping those highlights in check, even though sometimes it's not exactly seamless. When it comes to low light, the primary camera also holds up reasonably well. It's not excellent, but at least you can get some shots in low light. However, if you are in very low light, you'll probably find yourself using night mode a bit more. So about night mode, the primary rear camera is the only camera on this phone that supports night mode, but it is an incredibly handy mode to have in low light. Basically what it does is it shoots a number of photos and then merges them all automatically into a single bright and clean image. It does take its time, so it will take a few seconds to take a single photo, but the results are really impressive. You get very nice and clean images even when it's very dark. There is one drawback, however, when using night mode, and that is sometimes the colors can look very exaggerated and unnatural, almost like there's too much pop to the colors when you shoot an image using night mode. But at least it ensures that you get a shot while it's dark. The autofocus is also not bad. It does take a split second before it locks on, but once it locks on, it just snaps you right into focus. Complementing the main camera is the secondary telephoto camera. Unfortunately, I would say this camera is nowhere near as impressive as the main camera. Instantly, you realize that this camera has no OIS, which is a bit ironic because longer focal lengths tend to benefit a bit more from stabilization. Dynamic range is also quite far off from the main camera. It is quite a step down, unfortunately. I also don't particularly like the colors out of this camera. It's very subtle, but it appears less lifelike and a bit more dull. But the images are still reasonably detailed under good lighting, but in low light they can get quite terrible. Which is why if you use the 2x zoom function during normal shooting, it will switch to the secondary telephoto camera if it's bright, but if it is dark, it will not switch to the secondary camera. Instead, it will resort to a cropped image from the primary camera for the reason that it has a better low light performance. You can actually test this by activating the 2x zoom in a bright environment and then covering the top camera, which is the secondary telephoto camera, with your finger, and watch the software hop endlessly between the two cameras. It does kind of make sense because under bright lighting, the secondary camera will give you a more detailed image than the primary camera, but it's the other way around in low light. It is possible, however, to force the app to shoot with either camera through a setting in manual mode. And of course, this phone has portrait mode. But in portrait mode, you are forced to use the secondary telephoto camera for portrait mode. It will not work any other way, and we've already established that the secondary camera on this phone is not that good, which means portrait mode is not that good either. Back when I was using the OnePlus 5T, I found myself using portrait mode all the time, but after using the Mi Mix 3 as my daily driver for close to 4 months, I had almost no interest in using its portrait mode. The results out of portrait mode on this phone I would describe using the word pathetic. You barely even get any decent bokeh out of it. And it's hard to even get it to work because one minute the software tells you you're too far away, the next minute you're too near away, and because of the fact that it uses the secondary telephoto camera, portrait mode is basically unusable in low light. It's also got the studio lighting modes, almost exactly like the ones you saw on the iPhone. They do work reasonably well, but quite honestly speaking, I never quite understood the point of these modes. But moving on, we have the dual front-facing cameras, which are usually covered in lint because of the sliding mechanism, but you'll only be seeing images out of one of these cameras because the other camera functions solely as a depth sensor. So you'll be shooting out of the 24 megapixel front camera, and the supplementary depth camera is 2 megapixels. And although the main front camera has double the megapixel count of the rear camera, I don't necessarily find it to be more detailed. Dynamic range-wise, it's also not as good as the rear camera. Now, the selfie camera is not that amazing in low light, and because night mode does not work with the front-facing cameras, the only thing to assist you when you're taking a selfie in the dark is a selfie light. Now, this selfie light is hidden beneath the slider as well, next to your two front-facing cameras, and it is a continuous light. It is not a flash, because you activate it and it stays on when you take the image. So I have it enabled on here, and as you can probably tell, it is not very bright. I mean, I do have a very bright studio light right beside my face, but yes, it is actually not too bright, but it will definitely be sufficient to fill in some light on your face if you are shooting in a very dark environment. But if you are, say, backlit by the sun and you want to fill in the shadows on your face, this would probably not be enough. And this light was advertised to have a high CRI, so just to double check, I measured it using my Codecs C700, and sure enough, it gave me a CRI reading of at least 94, which is very good. This high CRI is important because it will render your skin tones more accurately. And out of curiosity, I just measured the rear torch as well, and that only scored a mid-80. But back to the front-facing cameras. Like usual front-facing cameras, this is using a fixed focus lens, so no autofocus there. But because it has a secondary depth camera, that means you can use portrait mode with the front-facing cameras. And I would actually say that the front-facing portrait mode works better than the rear-facing portrait mode. Now granted, it is not the most natural looking depth of field effect. Sometimes it can get a bit rough around the edges, but it still works better. But overall, I was actually slightly underwhelmed by the front-facing cameras because I was actually expecting them to be able to pack in some bigger and better tech thanks to the slider mechanism, so size should be less of an issue. But anyway, let's move on to the video capabilities of this phone camera. The rear main camera can pull off a 4K 60p. Now that is excellent, and that is something not even a lot of professional video cameras can pull off. It is possible to get some pretty great looking footage out of this phone camera. Shooting handheld, the optical image stabilization doesn't do wonders, but it certainly helps. The autofocus, however, in video mode is not very responsive. You do have to keep tapping on the screen to tell the camera where to focus, and when it does, it is not a graceful focus pull, it is more like a snap into focus movement. There is, however, no way to shoot video using the secondary telephoto camera, so if you want to zoom in when shooting a video clip, then it has to be a digital zoom. In terms of recording codecs, you can choose between good old H.264 and also the newer H.265. And there is slow motion video. We get it in 3 flavors, 120, 240, and 960 frames per second. The 120 and 240 FPS modes actually work just fine, and footage shot using those modes are actually saved as a high frame rate video file. With the exception of the 960 FPS mode, the footage is actually slowed down and saved as a 30 FPS clip. So I was a bit skeptical about the 960 FPS mode because it did sound very far-fetched, and my suspicions were confirmed when I tried it out. Looking at the footage, there is very noticeably some kind of interpolation being applied. The software is blending frames together to generate new frames to fill in the gaps in between. So it's most definitely not true 960 FPS, unfortunately. My guess is it's just some kind of enhanced 240 FPS. And what I find very annoying about the 960 FPS mode is you literally only have a quarter of a second to get your timing right. The 960 FPS is only applied to what is in real time a duration of literally 0.25 seconds, so it's really hard to get your timing right. There is no such limitation with the 120 and 240 FPS modes, so I would much rather shoot using those modes instead. And when you're shooting slow-mo video, you get to choose between 720p or 1080p resolution, but even after picking 1080p, it is the most pixelated 1080p I've ever seen. At first I thought it was just up-resed 720p footage, but then I realized 720p actually looks worse. If you shoot video using the front-facing camera, that maxes out at 1080p, so no 4K there, but the front-facing camera does have one more trick up its sleeve in video mode. There is portrait mode in video, and it actually works kind of well. Your resolution does get limited to 720p when you enable this, and very much like the portrait mode in photo mode, it is not perfect or seamless, but it works. This feature is also front camera exclusive, so you don't get this with the rear cameras. And that pretty much sums up the camera features on the Xiaomi Mi Mix 3. Did it live up to my expectations? Well, the rear primary camera most certainly did, but I can't say the same for the secondary telephoto camera. The front camera is acceptably good, but I do wish it could have been better. This is a very beautiful phone. It's got a lovely ceramic finish and a screen that goes edge to edge, and it would be a shame if the camera quality wasn't as beautiful as the phone itself. But that is it for my review. If you enjoyed it, do consider subscribing for more videos. Leave any questions or comments down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.